Hello and welcome to another episode of the Language Hacking Podcast. I am your host, Benny Lewis. This is a standalone episode where it'll just be me talking. This time, I like to call these the Ask Benny episodes. And on this one, I want to talk about the Pareto principle. This is also known as the 80-20 principle. And essentially, this guy Pareto had a theory that roughly 80% of consequences come from 20% of causes. And how this is applied can be thought of in many, many different specialties across the entire world. But of course, I'm much more interested in it when it comes to language learning. Now, I have used this in my personal and business life as well. I mean, when I decided to start my blog, I could have decided I need to get as much expertise in writing blogs as I possibly can. I'm going to spend years researching this, and I'm going to take a degree course in how to become a writer. But I didn't do that. I figured out what is the small amount that I can apply to this business where I could launch it as quickly as possible. And this is something similar I've done with language learning. So when beginners come into a language learning objective, a lot of them get bogged down with way too complicated things like grammar. And grammar is not something I suggest that you learn initially, or at least that you don't put that much effort into as an absolute beginner in the language. It is something I come to later, but grammar is a part of the non 20% that gives you the results initially. And this is why I would say that if you're starting off and your grammar is very choppy and you say me, want, go, you are at least communicating. So the grammar is not going to make a big difference in your ability to communicate for the most part as an absolute beginner. The other thing would be pronunciation. You do have to get a certain level of pronunciation so that people are definitely understanding you. But a lot of people get obsessed with trying to have native-like pronunciation and thinking if I don't get it perfect right now at the start, I'll never get it right because you can't teach an old dog new tricks, which I think is absolute nonsense. There are things like grammar and pronunciation that I have worked on much later in my language learning process. I have been able to get these to a very high level, but as a beginner, it's not necessary. The same goes with obscure vocabulary, and I don't really think that you need to learn every single word as you come across it. You don't need to know what shoelace is in the language when you're just starting to learn it. You don't even need to learn irrelevant vocabulary. So taking this Pareto principle into account, when I'm beginning to learn a language, I obviously need to know the word for Ireland because I'm from Ireland. I don't necessarily need to know the word for Australia because I may eventually talk about that. But in most of my initial conversations, because I'm not from there, I don't work there, I don't necessarily need to know a word like that, even though it is a very basic word that I should know as an intermediate level learner. But I just accept things that are more directly relevant to me. I want to make sure that that's what I'm working on. So I would highly suggest that you do this, that you take into account the things that are most necessary initially, and that would be speaking early, being okay with having choppy conversations, learning lots of vocabulary so that you can stick those in. And all of this accounts for the 20% of the language that's going to give you 80% of the results. So this is the Pareto principle when applied to language learning. Think of what are the most important priorities for what you need to be working on right now, and don't worry about the rest. Yes, you do have to eventually learn them, but that's not going to help you as much in the initial stages. Those can come later. So think of this when you are getting into your language project. What are the things I urgently, definitely need to know right now? That is the 20% that's going to give you 80% of your results. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope you've enjoyed this quick little thought of me answering the question of how does the Pareto principle work for language learning. If you've enjoyed this, make sure to shoot me a question. I'm at Irish Polyglot on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok. And You can ask me a question. I might respond to you there, or I might make a whole podcast episode about it. So if you've enjoyed this, do let me know. And until the next one, happy language learning.